We live in a time of extraordinary inequality. Bill Gates is millions of times richer than the man on the street. The super rich have left the rest of us far behind. Dead wrong. Sure, Bill Gates is 10 million times richer than I am, but is he really 10 million times better off than I am? Forget about dollars and cents for a moment and think about all the things that make for a good life. Yes, Bill Gates can travel by private jet, but the middle class can travel internationally nowadays as well. And on that plane, he probably eats similar food to what we eat. He might even use the same computer, the same cell phone as you and I. And he doesn't have 10 million times better access to the world's knowledge or entertainment. Our kids don't have a much smaller chance of being able to read and write, have access to food and safe water, and lead a long life. All that money cannot buy Bill Gates a much longer lifespan. In fact, all the things that make for a good life are now much more equally distributed than they have ever been. And one of the reasons is that some people like Bill Gates could make tons of money by making all these technologies and services much cheaper and so accessible to all of us. The famine in Africa is now so severe that the United Nations talks about the worst humanitarian crisis in the organization's history since 1945. So nothing has been done against world hunger for more than 70 years? Dead wrong. It's bad now, but it used to be much worse. In the 1940s, 50s and 60s, between 15 million and 20 million people died in famines every decade. And during the first 10 years of the 20th century, world hunger killed every 70th person on the planet. Then came modern farm technologies, artificial fertilizer, better crops, and above all, Norman Borlaug, the agronomist from Iowa who fought tirelessly to introduce high-yielding wheat in countries like Mexico, India and Pakistan. It has been said that Borlaug saved more lives than any other human being ever. Since the United Nations was founded in 1945, the number of people who face food insecurity has been reduced from every second person on the planet to a bit more than 1 out of 10. But in some African countries, governments and terrorist groups destroy farms and trade because they want to hurt their opponents. So the problem is not a food deficit, but a surplus of force, war and terror. You know, I like trade as much as the other guy, but especially I like exports. And to make exports great again, we need export subsidies. No, we don't. That's dead wrong. The whole point of trade is that no deal ever happens unless both sides think it's mutually beneficial, more so than any other deal would be. If that's not the case, well, then they find better uses for the resources. If the government steps in and subsidizes some exports, they divert trade away from that, away from the consumer preference, and the taxpayers have to pay for it. Politicians like Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton claim that America needs the Export-Import Bank to help small businesses to export. But that's not really what it does. The big bucks are being sent to big businesses with great political clout. In 2012, 83% of all the guarantees went to the exports of a single company, Boeing. And it just so happens that Boeing CEO had recently been named the chairman of the President's Export Council, and it just so happens that his advice to the President was to spend generously on export subsidies. So at least it makes some people happy. And that includes other countries, because when we export to them now, we subsidize their consumption. In 2016, San Diego started raising the minimum wage. At last, relief for low-wage earners. No, not really. That's dead wrong. Because the results are in and wages are up, but jobs are down. The food industry is especially vulnerable because many people work there on minimum wages. And 1 year after the increase, San Diego has 4,000 fewer food service jobs than it otherwise would have. Yes, we've raised the menu prices. Yes, we are going to raise them again, said one restaurant owner who had to fire 13 employees. Some people see their paycheck increase, but others see them drop to zero. And as economist Lynn Reeser concludes, they are the most vulnerable, the unskilled, the uneducated, people with any kind of criminal record. That's disastrous, because these are often the first jobs people get, where they can learn how to behave in a workplace, where they can pick up the skills so that they can move on to better jobs afterwards. But of course, some people have benefited, especially the producers of robots, of self-ordering kiosks and automated baristas. GDP per capita shows that we have entered a period of stagnation. Our lives just don't improve the way they used to. But that's probably dead wrong. Because GDP is great at measuring the output of wheat and steel, but it's terrible at capturing human wealth creation based on ideas and information, or improvements in quality, variety and comfort. How do you measure something that's for free? When people saved money for years to buy encyclopedia in the past, that showed up as wealth in GDP statistics. Now that it's available for free online, it's suddenly invisible. So one way of measuring the consumer surplus is to ask people, if this service or technology was suddenly gone, how much would you pay to get it back in your life? Joel Moker, the economic historian, asks us to consider anesthesia. If there was no way of reducing pain, what would you pay for anesthesia? Well, it barely shows up in GDP statistics, but if you ask someone when they're about to go into surgery, he'd probably be willing to pay something that approaches his total wealth. And consider the internet. Almost no one would give up the internet for $1 million. In fact, one study showed that a third would rather give up sex than give up the internet, which I think it's fair to say shows that it definitely underestimates its contribution to our well-being. 60 years ago, Ayn Rand published the novel Atlas Shrugged. It's an outdated, unrealistic description of entrepreneurs as heroes and politicians as villains. Dead wrong. There's nothing outdated about it. Almost every day something in the news reminds me of Atlas Shrugged. Politicians regulate and tax businesses out of existence. And when that hurts the economy, they squeeze the remaining ones even harder and blame free trade. Rand talked about how businessmen are either good at running their mills or at running to Washington for help. The world is now full of those crony capitalists who fail again and again and are saved by the government again and again. They're not capitalists, they're looters. And if you think that it's unrealistic with Rand's description of how more control results in more poverty, and more control, and more poverty, until we end up in dictatorship and chaos, well, then I suggest that you read up on what has just happened in Venezuela. And yet, almost 70% of all the wealth that has ever been created was created since Atlas Shrugged was published 60 years ago, because the atlases of the world are so creative. This is an amazing book. You should read it. Smartphones and tablets and games have ruined our children. They fill their world with distractions, so they no longer learn patience and delayed gratification. Dead wrong. This is the marshmallow test. How long can I wait before I eat it? If I wait long enough, I'll get 2. And yes, if you don't like marshmallows, you'll get something else instead. It's a classic test of self-control, and how long children can wait to eat the marshmallow predicts fairly well how they'll do in school later on, and if they're able to avoid obesity, drugs, crime. Most people assume that children do worse on the marshmallow test nowadays. Parents do and experts do. But that's wrong. The researcher John Protzko looked at all the marshmallow tests over the last 50 years, and he noticed that kids nowadays are twice as good at waiting for the marshmallow. For every decade, they can wait another minute. So why are parents and experts wrong? John Protzko calls this the kids nowadays effect. We always compare how impolite and impatient our kids are now to what we are like as adults, because we've forgotten all about how we were when we were kids. We were much worse. Millions of people escape war and oppression. We can't bring all of them here, but there is a solution: refugee camps. So we should help them over there instead. Dead wrong. Refugee camps are technocratic nightmares. Of course, they're better than staying in a war zone, but they deprive people of human opportunities, including the right to work. And they leave people stranded there for decades in misery. That's why in most countries only 10% stay in the refugee camps. Most people move to the cities to work in the informal sector. They're not allowed to, but they do it anyway because it gives them more opportunity and dignity. Even when economic freedom is extremely limited, it helps people more than UN camps. Refugees can benefit the host society too. Uganda is one of few countries that allow the refugees to work. And in the capital, 21% of the refugees own a business that employs at least one more person. 40% of those are Ugandan citizens. So the question shouldn't be, how can we move all of those people to the other side of the planet? Or how can we keep them out? Or how can we help them in UN camps? The question should be, why can't we get out of their way? It's been 50 years since the Cuban revolutionary Che Guevara was killed, an eternal symbol of resistance to oppression, of love and liberation. Dead wrong. Che Guevara was as much of a brutal communist tyrant as a North Korean dictator, only with a better haircut. And it's sad that this has been enough to fool leftist students and intellectuals for 50 years. After the Cuban Revolution of 1959, Che Guevara rejected the idea of returning to democracy and started building a police state. He oversaw summary executions and led the building of labor camps, where he sent gays, religious minorities, democratic socialists, and farmers who protested when their land was stolen. Guevara wrote that his soldiers must be motivated by hatred to become cold-killing machines. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, Guevara urged the Soviets to destroy America with nuclear weapons. So, the next time you see someone with a Che Guevara t-shirt, ask them if they have the whole series, including Goebbels, Pol Pot and Mussolini. Ja, warum nicht? Okay, tschüss Angela. The European Union has just banned mobile network operators from charging us extra when we use our cell phones in other European countries. No more roaming charges. Great, eh? No. That's dead wrong. The operators cannot charge us anymore for a costly service, so how will they make up for it? Easy. They charge us more when we use our cell phones in our own countries. So prices now increase and the amount of data available in our subscription plans decrease. In some instances, the prices have been increased by 66%. This is a regressive tax. It is great for people like me or EU officials who travel around Europe all the time. But who gets to pay the price? The people who stay back home. Isn't it funny how they always say that we need regulation to protect the little guy from big businesses, and always end up with plans to take from the poor and give to the rich? I think they should use their new fancy no-roaming subscription plans to Google the concept unintended consequences. Remember how the cash machine replaced all the bank tellers in the 1970s? The same thing is now happening in every industry. The robots are coming and the jobs are going. Dead wrong. When machines help us to solve old problems faster or cheaper, it frees up time and purchasing power to solve other problems, and that creates new jobs. Sometimes this even happens in the same industry, when man and machine are complementary. When the cash machine was introduced in the 1970s, it freed up bank staff from solving routine tasks, and instead they could focus on more profitable tasks where they were better than the machine, like personal advice. It also meant that bank branches could be smaller and cheaper, so the banks opened up more of them. Look at this cup of coffee. This was made by a machine. I didn't have to grind the beans and boil the cup, and that freed up my time so that I could study employment statistics instead. The US now has some 500,000 cash machines, and yet the number of bank tellers has not declined since the 1970s. It has almost doubled. Racism is a Western invention, and Western colonialism the defining experience of human history. And we enslave more than anybody else, and all those things we learned at university. They are dead wrong. If anything is Eurocentric, this is it. The white man has committed horrible acts of slavery and murder, which cannot be excused by anyone. But so did men of all other colors. In a myth-busting new book, Swedish author Fredrik Segerfeldt points out that of the 10 biggest empires of human history, only 3 were Western European. And what European colonialists brutally conquered were often other empires, the Moguls, the Aztecs, the Incas. Neither was slavery a Western monopoly. The Arab trade with African slaves was more extensive than the transatlantic slave trade. And there were more slaves in Africa than African slaves in the United States. But for some reason, it seems like we stop caring about atrocities when our ancestors aren't involved. Throughout history, almost every culture has been racist and tried to invade and enslave their neighbors. If we are to be judged by our past, we are all guilty. But the real difference is that some cultures try to stop, while some try to persist. And hey, here's a note to publishers out there. Fredrik's book is not yet translated into English. The laissez-faire idea of perfect competition is a pipe dream. Instead, we see more concentration, more monopolies, and we need more regulation to stop it. Dead wrong. 2 economists recently looked for explanations for monopolies, and they found that concentration increased the most in the industries that had become more regulated. Regulation is often a barrier to entry. Often it involves permits and license requirements that directly block new competitors. But sometimes rules are just not adapted to new innovative business models. And generally, old incumbents with huge resources can deal with regulations better. Old banks employed thousands of people to deal with new regulations. They can do that. New upstarts can't. So, one study showed that a 10% increase in the intensity of regulation in a sector leads to a 0.5% decrease in firm births. Regulations inhibited employment in small businesses. So, if you want fewer monopolies, there is a policy for the government. Stay out of the way. Immigrants used to blend in, behave well and work hard, but this time it's different. The immigrants now are different. They're more criminal and have dangerous beliefs. Dead wrong. Because that's what we said about every new generation of immigrants before they had time to integrate. America is a land of immigrants, but every new group has always been met with suspicion. When the Germans and Swedes first came, it was said that they couldn't handle freedom because they came from authoritarian countries and they would never learn the English language. But later on they were of course seen as model citizens compared to the Irish and the Italians, who were criminals and worse, Catholics. But obviously they were later seen as ideal immigrants compared to the new group, the Chinese, who weren't even Christians. But later on, they were seen as peaceful and hard-working compared to the Mexicans and the Muslims. Because everything new is scary. As the migration scholar Aristide Zolberg pointed out, everything now said about the unsuitability of Muslims for life in a liberal democracy was first said about the Irish in the United States. Test shows that Swedish and American students are much worse than Asian ones. Year after year, Western students are being out-educated by the Chinese. Dead wrong, or at least not the whole truth. Western students do perform much worse on international tests like PISA, but is that because they are much worse, or because they just don't care that much when it comes to a test that has no effect on their individual grades? In one experiment in secondary schools in China and the US, one group of students got to answer questions in mathematics from the PISA test. Another group got the same questions, but they were also told that they could make $25 if they got through the test without errors. Interestingly, the Chinese students who got this financial incentive didn't perform better than the ones who didn't, which suggests that they already exerted maximum effort. But the American students who got the financial incentive performed much better. So perhaps they could do it all the time, but they just didn't care. Sometimes a test simply fails the test. After the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution, some said that despite all the horrors we should be grateful because Soviet communism defeated Hitler in the Second World War. But they are dead wrong. Far from blocking Hitler, the Soviet Union helped him start the war. In August 1939, they signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which divided Europe in two spheres. And 1 week later, the war started, and communists all over Europe defended the Nazis. The Soviets and the Germans coordinated military movements, and for 2 years, Stalin supplied Hitler's war machine with all the oil, food and raw material that he needed. The pact only ended when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, and then he almost won immediately because Stalin had recently purged his military of tens of thousands of men, including his ablest officers. And the army was totally unprepared because Stalin had ignored all the warnings of an imminent German attack, because the paranoid Stalin trusted Hitler more than he trusted his own spies. We in the Generation X, and even more the millennials, came too late. Our parents and our grandparents took all the best jobs with the high incomes, and there's nothing left for us. Except that's dead wrong. True, the old are better off, but that's because they are older, so they've had more time to work, to save and accumulate wealth. But if you compare us to where they were at the same age, as the OECD recently did, you get a very different picture. When we who were born in the 1970s were between 35 and 39 years old, our average disposable income was 62% higher than for those born 40 years earlier. Real income at the same age has grown by an average of 1.3% per birth year since 1910 across the OECD countries. True, recently the income of the young has stopped rising, but that seems more like a result of the global financial crisis, and that has affected the old as well. So the young today make up the most miserable generation only if you accept all the previous generations.